Thanks for clicking. Let's get right into this full story. So, I live in a neighborhood governed by an HOA, Homeowners Association, and let me tell you, these people are absolutely obsessed with rules. I understand wanting to keep the place looking nice, but they take it to the next level. Every time I turn around, there's some new rule they're enforcing. From making sure your grass is exactly 2 inches tall, to limiting how many garden gnomes you're allowed to have. Yes, you read that right. It feels like they're just looking for a reason to fine people. Now, I'm generally a laid-back person, and I don't mind following reasonable rules. But after the HOA fined me for having a slightly off shade of paint on my front door, it was only a little different from the approved color. I'd had enough. I knew something had to be done. So, I did what any reasonable person would do. I decided to play by their rules, but only in the most insufferable way possible. I started with the garden gnome issue. Apparently, the HOA had a very strict no more than 3 gnomes rule, and my front yard had 4. Well, I went to the dollar store and bought every garden gnome I could find. I ended up with over 30 gnomes, ranging from the standard red-hatted ones to a few that were holding tiny fishing poles, and even one that looked like it was in a yoga pose. I wasn't about to skip the chance to throw in a little flair. I lined them up along my front lawn, every single one. At first, it seemed like a fun little protest, but then I thought, why not take it even further? I made sure to place a small, polite sign in front of the gnomes that read, "Approved by HOA, in accordance with neighborhood guidelines." Naturally, the HOA sent me a warning within 2 days, demanding that I remove the excessive gnomes or face a fine. I waited for a bit and then responded with a letter. I included photos of my yard, plus a few photos of my neighbors' yards, showing that their decorative items, statues, bird baths, and fountains weren't subjected to the same strict rules. I pointed out that unequal enforcement of the HOA's policies and even cited a few cases where some of the other houses were in violation of the guidelines, but had never been fined. I CC'd the entire HOA board on the letter for added effect. I got a response within the week. They were looking into the matter and that I should temporarily reduce the number of gnomes while they review my request. But the best part? The moment I received that response, I went out and bought even more gnomes. I was determined to push them to their limit. A few days later, the HOA president, let's call him Mr. By the Book, shows up at my door. He's a well-dressed guy, looks like he just stepped out of a corporate meeting, and he's holding a clipboard. He wastes no time getting straight to the point. "Good afternoon," he says, adjusting his glasses. "I'm here about the issue with your lawn gnomes." I try to keep a straight face, but honestly, I'm barely containing my amusement. "Oh yes, I'm aware. I've been in contact with the HOA about them." He proceeds to tell me that while they appreciate my enthusiasm for community involvement, my gnome display still violates HOA rules, and I need to cut the number down to 3. I nod along, acting like I'm considering his request. But then I casually mention, by the way, I've also noticed a couple of houses that have more than 3 gnomes or similar items in their yards. How come they haven't received the same attention? He hesitates for a moment, clearly thrown off guard by my observation. I press a little more. I have a feeling I might have missed a memo. If there's a limit to garden gnomes, there must also be a limit on other lawn decorations, right? At this point, Mr. By the Book starts sweating a little. He stammers something about how enforcement varies based on the situation. Yeah, no kidding. He says that someone from the HOA will be out to check the other yards soon. Great. I'll be sure to look out for that, I say, grinning. But in the meantime, I'll keep the gnomes exactly where they are, as per your request. He fumbles a bit more, finally gives me a tight-lipped smile, and leaves, telling me that I'll hear from the HOA soon. That night, I receive another letter from the HOA, claiming they'd reviewed the situation and decided my gnome display was indeed excessive and must be reduced. However, they also noted that after reviewing other properties, a uniform enforcement of the rules would be implemented soon. Translation, they were now too embarrassed to fine anyone else, so they had no choice but to start enforcing all the rules across the board. A week later, the HOA sends out a mass email to the entire neighborhood. They're officially cracking down on all violations, and they've hired a third-party company to perform inspections. The email includes a list of rules that they'll be more strictly enforcing, and I'm just sitting there with a smug grin, knowing what's about to unfold. The email states that they'll be inspecting yards for a range of violations: excessive lawn decorations, unapproved paint colors, fence height discrepancies, and even how many chairs are on your front porch. I immediately pull out my phone and start sending messages to a few of my neighbors, the ones who have been most vocal about my gnome display. I let them know the HOA is about to be all over everyone's yards, and I've got the receipts. Within hours, I've got a handful of neighbors agreeing to help me. One of them, Karen, yes, her name is actually Karen, has an inflatable unicorn in her front yard and a garden full of pink flamingos. Another neighbor, Jim, has more than 5 gnomes scattered around his yard. Another has a massive statue of a frog by his mailbox that, according to the HOA's guidelines, is a visual obstruction. They're all on board with the plan. We're going to expose how ridiculous these rules are by forcing the HOA to enforce them equally, even if it means they'll have to fine half the neighborhood. So, we all start going a little overboard. Karen adds a few more flamingos to her yard, Jim pulls out a few more gnomes, and I make sure to add 10 more gnomes to my front lawn. Oh, and just for fun, I place a huge garden gnome right in front of the HOA president's house, holding a sign that says, "Welcome to the neighborhood." It doesn't take long for the HOA to start sending out notices. I get a warning about my excessive gnome collection, Jim gets one for his frogs, and Karen, well, she gets a full-blown fine for her flamingo army. The HOA even sends a letter to all of us, reminding everyone that they're seriously cracking down on these issues. But the fun doesn't stop there. With each notice, I send a formal complaint to the HOA, using their own rules to point out violations in other people's yards. I start asking questions. Why does Jim's frog statue still stand while my gnomes are getting singled out? And is Karen's excessive flamingo display really a problem? Or is it just the HOA targeting a certain type of decoration? The HOA is now getting bombarded with complaints. They're trying to issue fines, but they've opened a can of worms. People are protesting everything: garden gnomes, fences, bird baths, even the color of paint on their houses. They can't control it anymore. The icing on the cake? I get a letter a few days later from the HOA president himself, apologizing for the unnecessary attention my gnome collection has drawn to the neighborhood. They've decided to reassess the decoration guidelines, and of course, my fine is officially dismissed. At this point, I'm practically sipping my tea while watching the chaos unfold. The HOA has made a huge mess of things, and the neighborhood is in full revolt. Every day, I'm getting texts from neighbors who are either complaining about fines or laughing about the absurdity of the situation. The HOA, once a well-oiled machine of micromanagement, has become a punchline in our community. Neighbors who'd never cared about the rules before are suddenly united in protesting them. Even the ones who used to snitch about minor violations are keeping their heads down, too afraid to draw attention to their own yards. But then things really start to take a turn. The HOA holds a meeting to address the backlash. It's an open meeting, so anyone can attend, and of course, I decide to show up. I wear a t-shirt that says, "I Red Heart Gnomes," and naturally, I bring a few friends along: Karen, Jim, and a couple of other neighbors who are tired of the HOA's nonsense. We're ready to make a scene if necessary. The meeting starts with the HOA president trying to regain control, talking about restoring order and upholding the integrity of the community. But as soon as he starts talking about the fines, Karen stands up. She holds up her flamingo yard decoration guide and asks, "So, which one of these are illegal exactly?" I'm trying not to laugh, but it's hard to keep a straight face. The room goes quiet as the HOA president stammers out an answer that doesn't make any sense. Then Jim pipes up, asking why some of the rules apply to certain people and not others. He reads off a list of violations from various neighbors, some of which are way more ridiculous than my gnome collection. The HOA president starts getting visibly agitated, but we don't stop. We keep pushing the issue, questioning every little thing. The longer we talk, the more we realize how absurd their rules really are, and how little thought actually went into them. It becomes clear that the HOA is scrambling to figure out how to handle the situation without losing control entirely. And then, oh, this is my favorite part, Karen pulls out her trump card. She stands up with a huge binder in her hands, the kind that looks like it holds 1,000 pages, and says, "I've been collecting records of all the violations in the neighborhood over the past year, including the ones that have already been fined. Would you like me to share them with everyone here?" The room goes silent. The HOA president looks like he's about to faint. Karen doesn't even let him answer. She starts reading off violation after violation, pointing out how many people were fined for things that others got away with. It's like opening Pandora's box. In the end, the HOA president and his board members are forced to call a vote. The neighborhood overwhelmingly votes to restructure the HOA, including a complete review of all rules and guidelines. There's talk of dissolving the HOA altogether, and suddenly, everyone in the room is acting like they've been working toward that goal all along. As for me, I'm just sitting there, grinning, knowing I've single-handedly turned the HOA into a laughingstock. My gnome army stands tall, still proudly on my lawn, and now, everyone in the neighborhood knows that sometimes, the best way to get back at the system is to make it totally unravel. In the weeks that follow, the HOA's power continues to shrink. The vote to restructure passes, and with it, a complete overhaul of the rules. The once strict enforcement of arbitrary guidelines is replaced by a more relaxed approach. They now focus on actual safety concerns and the occasional complaint about things like overgrown lawns, but no one cares about whether you have a few extra gnomes on your lawn anymore. As for me, my front yard remains a whimsical display of gnome glory. Every time I look at it, I can't help but smile at the absurdity of it all. In the end, I got exactly what I wanted. Not only did I avoid a fine, but I helped bring down the HOA's oppressive grip on the neighborhood. The best part? Every time someone new moves into the neighborhood, I make sure to point out the legend of the Gnome Rebellion. It's a story everyone enjoys, and I'm pretty sure I've become a local hero in the process. Now, when people mention the HOA, it's usually in the context of how they're trying to keep things cool and relaxed after the big restructure. No one mentions the gnome incident anymore, because it became too much of a victory to ignore. And as for the HOA president and his board, well, they've started showing up to neighborhood events in an effort to rebuild their reputation, but it's hard to take them seriously when they keep nervously eyeing my lawn, still wondering if they should start enforcing the 2 gnome limit.